Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel, Design Elements of Contemporary Strategy Games, and Contemporary Perspectives in Game Design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 20, Designing Games, Simulation of Movement in Wargames. In any event, I'm Professor Phillies. This is IMG 2500, Game Design. Today, I am going to be discussing two things. I am going to be discussing advice from designers on how to design a game and get something that works. And I am going to be doing the first of my segments on design of board wargames. My quotations, not quite quotations, advice from game designers comes mostly from design elements of contemporary strategy games. It comes from one of the rear chapters where we line up a bunch of people who give advice that's good for a paragraph or a few paragraphs. The first piece of advice, which is actually rather central, is the importance of playtesting. That is, you play a game again and again and again. You have different groups of people play it again and again. They test the variations, and if you're lucky, the playtesters catch all of the unfortunate features and tell you whether you have a decent game or something that needs to be left on the shelf for a while until you have some more ideas. There are several failure modes of playtesting. The simplest failure mode of playtesting is I wouldn't want to hurt their feelings by telling them that their game is absolutely awful, so I'll tell them how wonderful it is. And that failure mode, well, it's nice you have people who love you in some sense, but they certainly are not doing you any good. It's like the people who think you really ought to lose 150 pounds, or maybe 200 pounds, but they're not going to suggest that perhaps being 200 pounds too heavy is going to send you to an extremely early grave in an extremely unpleasant manner. They'll just say, well, some people have this or that or whatever. Okay, what other playtest failure modes are there? There are playtesters who look at a game and decide they're the designers, and they're going to redesign the game, and where you had something, they'll say, well, what you really need is A, B, C, D, where A, B, C, D are a stack of complicated rules, and they give you a playtest rule on the game they've redesigned. This approach, in general, is totally worthless. If you hit the point where a game is broken, for example, there are no rules for moving any of the unit counters around the board, and it's quite clear that since this is a horse racing game, that movement of the horses ought to be significant. There's a point at which you tell the designer the rules are broken at point X and need to be fixed. Or thinking back to the early days of board wargaming design, Operation Gigantus, World War III game, shouldn't there be some rules for airplanes or warships hiding in here? There weren't in the original. That was fixed. It turned into a pretty decent game that sold a fair number of copies eventually, too. The third failure in game design is, or another failure anyhow, is people who say X doesn't work, but neglect to give any evidence of why they think X doesn't work or what they don't like. It's sort of like people taking your essays and saying, I don't like your writing style, and neglecting to mention what the issues are. I mean, I don't like your writing style because it sounds like an early Victorian novel. The instructions were prose, not iambic pentameter, fully rhymed. There are whole bunches of things that can go wrong, But playtest reports that are non-communicative are sometimes not helpful. Of course, sometimes it can be, where is the game? And those of you who were around 2 years ago will recall someone who showed up to give a long lecture on designing a global warming game. And I finally decided to cut in and say, in essence, well, it was very nice, but where is the game in here? We see all of this geological data and geographic data and this and that, but how do you turn this, where is the playing thing? And it eventually turned out, as the fellow confessed, the game part hadn't quite worked as well as planned, but the development as far as it had gone, if you looked at it, was actually very nicely done. It was just that at some point there can be serious issues that really need fixing, and there's not much you can say about it. Okay, playtesting. Playtesting is of several different sorts. There is playtesting where you push the pieces around the table yourself to see if things work. You can do playtesting where you check against the rules at each step to see if you're following the rules you wrote down correctly. Some people neglect to do that, sometimes with amusing outcomes. Then you can playtest with close friends. Those will give you some critiques better than others. You can also do blind playtesting, and we are advancing from playtesting when you're in the playing group. This week you're going to do blind playtesting where, yeah, the playtest group and the design group can communicate with each other, but it's going to be written down and thoughtful and such not, and the reports will reflect what was written down so you have some impression of what's going on. You can have much more elaborate playtesting efforts. There are computer design game design companies, big ones, and yes, they will have someone in to blind playtest this new game. And when we say things are fully instrumented, not only is every keystroke recorded, not only are the mouse movements recorded, but these funny little gadgets near the computer screen are recording the eye movements so you can see what on the screen or whatever is being watched. And if the reason, for example, that the player does not notice the orange on blue flashing to violet on yellow, the nuclear reactor is exploding. If the players are ignoring this, despite the fact it's using the blink icon, and you wonder why, the answer, of course, may be they're looking at the wrong part of the screen, and their attention is so riveted on that part of the screen that nothing else is happening. Of course, this can also happen in real life. There was the Air Force of one country, which I will not identify, to protect the guilty, and they tried various arrangements of signaling to warn a pilot of imminent catastrophe, like loud horns, bells, shrieks, and they finally got, I shall have to translate since what was actually said was not necessarily in American English. How do we attract the attention of the pilot to the fact that he's about to need to bail out, or the aircraft will depart his seat without his doing anything? Honey child, you set my engines on fire! And it is a high-pitched, sultry female accent. It was actually done not necessarily in English, and what they discovered, amusingly enough, is this worked equally well for male and female pilots. The male pilots had their attention drawn for the obvious reason. The female pilots had their attention drawn by the strong desire to kill whoever came up with this male chauvinist scheme. It worked. I don't know if they put it into production, though. So you can do very heavily instrumented things, and the fact that you think it's obvious that there are intense warnings being given to the players or the graphics is working well does not mean that the graphics is working well for the players. As a practical matter, though, computation keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. Television keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. As a practical matter, board game companies do not have the sort of resources and budget that computer game companies do, and board game testing is a little less electronically intense. Okay, what else is there about designing games? Recommendations of designers. The first recommendation is design something you would like to play. Choose themes you're interested in, choose playing mechanisms you're interested in, choose graphics you're interested in, though your graphics probably get redone and the game may be rethemed. Choose things you would find attractive. If you find them attractive, you're invested in them, and the results will be better. Something that works very poorly, and this is actually true in large numbers of different parts of life, is deciding I will anticipate what the other fellow is thinking, and I will do what I think they want. That usually works very badly unless you're a telepath, because you actually do not know what the other person is thinking or wants or desires. I have seen this. I'll give an example or two from other parts of life. As you go out, at some point you will be putting out vitae to prospective employers, and one of the things you might be tempted to add to your vitae or your resume is the professional societies that you belong to. Now, I am not dumping on professional societies, and some people find this attractive. However, in my very long experience as a faculty member looking at application files for faculty positions, I have never seen professional society membership used except in the completely negative. This person belongs to X, we should not hire him or her, or it, I'm not saying. It would not occur to you that this was the case. I was simply giving you the practical experience. You don't know what other people are thinking. Be true to yourself and things will work better. Correspondingly, if you are sending a game off to a publisher, this is now the board game advice, you ought to know what your publisher does. And this is even more true for computer games, where there are games you play on a computer, games you play on a telephone, games you play in 3 minutes, games that require several hundred hours of playing time to get to the far end. You notice there's a variety here, which most of you probably know just as well as I do. And you look at the publisher and you ask, is this something the publisher would want? And someplace there is the publisher who produces 200-hour World War II games, and the publisher who produces 50 hours of blood and gore modern combat games, and the publisher, there have been several of these actually, whose focus is games that are targeted on 8 to 12-year-old girls who experimentally want something very different than boys of the same age, at least as a group, and found a niche market. And you need to know something about the publisher before you send them something that they certainly will not be interested in. Game companies computer companies, of course, do things a bit more differently than board game companies do. You will find it useful to read the discussion of board game companies and how they do things as a broadening exercise, a consciousness elevating exercise, because you realize there are different ways to do the same thing and you ought to be sensitive to them. What about graphics and such not? Well, we had an unfortunate technical failure in which one of the playtest groups last week actually did not have a board for a game that required one, and they managed to fake it. And it was certainly not the sort of fake I would want to be presented with at the end of the season. But you know, sometimes something very simple is perfectly adequate for good reasons. The advice of most designers cuts in two directions, and one of the directions is, unless you're in the art track, they'd phrase this slightly differently, unless you're in the art track, putting huge amounts of effort into the graphics of components is probably not a good investment. But if you are in the art track and you show up with 200 hand-painted tiles showing the terrain, and they're all different and they're all obviously first-rate hand-painted, it'll do very well in your portfolio, trust me. However, graphics should be good enough that it's not clumsy to play things. Little cut-out, thin paper slips as opposed to unit counters that you can hang onto when you try to pick them up. That's positive. Unit counters that don't blow away because someone walks down the far side of the room and sets up eddies in the air, that's a good idea too. It's really distracting to have your huge army, it better not be an army in the games you're designing, swept away by a breeze and blown off the table. You don't want to be in quite that boat. What else can we say? Well, one of the advice bits that you're given is that you really have to be willing to knock off what seem to be the good ideas that cannot quite be made to work, that do not match the theme, that are too tedious to execute in a hand as opposed to an automated game, and you have to be willing to knock things off. The corresponding advice for a novelist, especially if you are not the person who outlines everything first, or sometimes if you are, you have a first draft, and one of the things you do when you rewrite, this is the advice of Robert Heinlein, is to go in there and cut out, 15 or 25% of the words. 15% is a traditional target. Yes, it does matter which 15%, the 15% that made it longer without adding quite as much to it. The opposite of this approach, which some people try, there are a number of science fiction authors whose novels are about yay thick. And if those of you who read science fiction can probably name, 3 or 4 authors, one of whom has unfortunately recently passed away, who write like this, and the fans think it's incredible and wish it was like this instead of merely like that. But cutting things out is often a good idea. One piece of advice which it is physically impossible to implement in this class is the advice that works with good wine. You take a good wine and you put it in a controlled cellar for a few years or a decade, or if it's some Soleras of whatever. I have had a taste of a 1763 Solera. That's when it started, of course. Absolutely wonderful. And aging a product before you bring it out is a good idea, because you will look at things afresh, and then you will be the one to notice, isn't there supposed to be some way to move the horses around the racetrack here? And the things that you overlooked, you will now pick up. Unfortunately, while it's nice to say we should age things for a while, you can't do that in this course because, you know, we only have so many weeks, like 7, and some of your game designs, actually this class was better than some in most respects. It looked as though there'd been a decent amount of work done on things. Sometimes you have to do the equivalent of this product, you're working at company X and everyone agrees this product is not right for us, and the bits and pieces will carry on when you head off to wherever because they weren't wanted where you were. The equivalent here would be we have game design groups, and I've already done 2 consultations of the, my game design group has question X. I did not in either case suggest at some point a divorce is the best solution, and we may have to reshuffle things, but hopefully matters will work out, and if any of you wish to consult with me, again, I am happy to do that. On the other hand, sometimes you just have to carry things through so that the child, meaning in this case the game, gets carried through to the far end. So those are comments from designers. Other comments, a mechanism may be very cute, it may be very clever, but there was a nice piece of advice. A game designer is an artisan, not an artiste. What is the difference? An artisan is someone who makes things very well, but what it is well known. So if it is a coffee mug, it may be nicely done, it may be beautiful, but it has the functional features that it actually, if you pour coffee into it, there are not nice holes around the bottom rim through which the coffee flows out. This is not to say you cannot be creative. If you look at most of the coffee mugs you have ever seen, they look vaguely like that. Maybe they're narrower and taller. Look familiar? Well, pointy base, wide top means that the center of mass is up here someplace, and narrow bottom means that the angle of tilt you need before the mechanically stable form is rather narrow. And so one fine day, someone had the brilliant idea of a coffee mug shaped like that. I have one. It's extremely stable. It really sits there. However, if you are sort of the person who puts sugar in the coffee or preserves in the tea, you should notice that unless you have a test tube brush or maybe some more sophisticated mechanical device, cleaning it is going to be an interesting exercise. I did, however, once acquire and do not have the source, and unfortunately made in California is not quite as useful as the product of Liechtenstein. There we go. Really fat base, fat at the bottom, narrower at the top, nice big handle, big enough to hang on to as opposed to your teacup handles, which are really easy to hang on to if you're under 3. This is artisan work. This is what a good artisan does. The product is well defined, but the point of designing the product is, does the product work? What is the opposite? The artiste. The artiste is the person who insists that he or she is right and these stupid consumers are completely wrong and can be ignored. Of course, if you're lucky, the snob appeal works. I had relatives who used to live, this goes back some decades, on the tip of Long Island, and at the base of their road, they were up on the cliff top. There was one of America's most famous artists. All I can say is the paintings tend to look like the atomic explosion in the paint factory, and the explosion did not char the canvas, but there are people who think his work was superb and pay 7-digit sums for it. What can I say? So I have now said something about design, and we will return to this, and I will discuss what some of the other authors have advised. What I'm going to do for the remaining 20 minutes, though, is to do one of my 3 fractional lectures on design of board war games. There will be one on movement, that's today. There will be one on combat, that's maybe tomorrow. Oh, and some point in the future, there will be one on everything else. Logistics, morale, command and control, all of the topics that real senior military people think are the most important. Okay, so the basic issue on movement, you have some little blocks that represent, well, for one of your games, it's thieves in a building, and for another of your games, it's trappers moving across the map. But the basic constraint, if you don't want to avoid impossible arguments on whether moves were legal or not, is that you have a map grid and you have rules for moving relative to the map. Now, maybe you are moving along the spaces from space to space. It may be you're moving from line intersection to line intersection using the dual grid. Nonetheless, the movement rules you have are necessarily integer approximations. You should realize, incidentally, that all computer games are exactly the same. There is no way, in fact, it's a fundamental math impossibility, to represent an arbitrary real number and store it. And what computers do when they say they're doing floating point is some clever work with things that in fact are integers and denote count markers. But in fact, in the end, a computer only stores bits. The bits make bytes. The bytes make numbers, which are in fact integers, even if they pretend to be floating point. So, having said we're going to store things in integers, the question is, what do we do? And the first answer is, we put down, assuming I can find a working pen, we put down a map grid. So there's a map grid. And so you are allowed to move along the map grid. And you start here. And you might say, I can only move horizontally and vertically. And so this distance is actually 2 units. But if you actually measure this off, it's 1.4 units. And so there's a bit of distortion. And the distortion is, gee, the distortion is about 0.6 error out of 1.4. That's not quite 50%. Your other choice, a second choice, is to say, I start here. This is one movement point. Yes, it should be 1.4 because you're moving sideways. And the 1.4, the 1 rather than the 1.4 is an error of about 0.41 over 1.4. And that number is about 2/7 or 30%. If you're even more clever, several of you have commented that drawing hexagons is a nuisance. And you will notice I don't do it very often if I can avoid it for very sound reasons. Nonetheless, there are some hexagons. Here's another hexagon. And if I move out this way and then move to here, that's an error relative to being able to magically move in a straight line. See that? And that error is supposedly, I've never checked the math myself, but supposedly that's about a 14% error. And this is why a lot of board war games use hexagons, because the grid distortion is much less with hexagons than it is with squares. Except one fine day, around 1966, I observed the following, which is used in the MIT Strategy Games Society game, Strategy 1, not to be confused with the later SPI title of the same title. 2, 3, yes? So this is actually, if this is a 1, this is a 1.5. You could do it by fractions, but it's much faster to count integers than fractions. So this is an error of 0.09. Actually, it's less than that, over 1.4, or about Yeah, 6%. And you notice, if you start with the crudest possible movement rule, the distortion is quite large. As you get cleverer, the distortion is smaller. If you're clever enough to change the grid, it gets smaller still. But gee, you can be original. The original version was 1, 1.5, and if you don't mind moves in which you have to count by, say, sixths or twelfths, some people complain about this. I don't know. Some people just complain a lot. If you don't mind things like that, you've got issues. But we actually made it so that everything was an integer, and you just had to count by integers, which most normal people can do. So those are, can we be clever with the map grid to avoid gridding errors? Hexagons got into the board wargaming hobby with the Avalon Hill board wargame D-Day. However, they weren't original there, and if you can find a small number of photographs from the 1950s from Rand Corporation, which was a military think tank which was substantially funded by specific branches of the government. And if you look carefully, there are hexagons and there are stacks of units on each hexagon. Well, in any event, I have said a bit about your map grid, and your map grid affects movement. You might, however, say, well, how do you go about simulating movement, and especially for military games? In a reasonable military event, everyone on both sides is moving all the time. Now, some of them, the smart people, are digging their foxholes deeper as fast as they can. There is nothing like being shot at to persuade you you'd really like to move the shovel faster. However, entrenching tool, drill sergeants would complain if I said shovel. Having said that, in any event, the answer is that this first solution, this goes back to Charles Roberts' 1953 game, Tactics, was to say, I move my army and we launch attacks. Now it's your turn to move, and you move your army and you launch your attacks. And the scheme is sometimes called I go, you go. Some people find that acronym or whatever it is a bit amusing. There are all sorts of people out there. But the general idea is you take turns, but unlike in chess where you get only to move one piece, in board war games a typical statement is you get to move all of your pieces. There are, however, refinements on this, and I can give a few refinements. And one is to say, well, you have an army, but the army is broken up into groups of units. And instead of being able to move the whole army, you, for example, are allowed to choose one group of units and move them. And then the other side gets to choose one group of units and move them. An amusing variation on this is to say, we will have these little cardboard chits or cards, and we will shuffle the deck of cards, and the cards are labeled and we will draw cards, and we will decide who gets to move first. And this reflects the uncertainty of command control, namely, you can write orders, tell the right flank to attack, but in most periods until recently, the order has to get from here to the right flank. The right flank commander has to get his act together and his subordinates together, and eventually something will happen. Tolstoy's description of the Battle of Borodino is sort of the low estimate of this. His estimate was, in essence, yeah, the people march at each other and the generals look decorative but don't really do anything. And the causes of victory are not the brilliant generalship, but the forces of history pushing on you. He phrased it much more elegantly than I did. Of course, I said you draw cards, but this is the heroic, well-led army. So every unit gets to move, but there are two ABCD cards, sets of ABCD cards. There's one set of 1, 2, 3, 4 cards, and now suddenly, more often than not, this army moves once each of its units before this army does. You can get the same effect by rolling dice. In Game Designer Workshop, I think it's ILAO. In ILAO, the Russian player who has 8 army corps must decide which of his corps to move, and at the start of the game he's only allowed to move 2 of them on a turn. To make life even more amusing, he doesn't get to choose at the start of the turn. He has to choose several turns in advance which of his armies will be moving. Before the game starts, he writes down 1, 2, 1, 2, and if for the first 3 turns the French are doing that and attacking the units that don't get to move for a while yet, he may be very unhappy because the French will have tactical initiative. And he has to think very carefully, how does he handle this so he gets the right results? So that is sort of a bit of command and control too. Now, the simplest move is checkers or Chinese checkers. You pick up the one unit you're going to move. You move it to one adjoining space. You stop. In Chinese checkers, you have the amusing hopping opportunities where if you have things set up from the front, you can jump over several spaces and get a piece way out in front all by itself. And so there are amusing things. If you're less careful, you take advantage of these, and suddenly there's this one piece of yours way in the back all by itself where it's not going anyplace very fast. And this is why there's an interesting set of tactics there. Well, having said interesting set of tactics, the board war game equivalent, if you have ships, or aircraft, things are fairly simple. For ships or aircraft, you're in a 2- or 3-dimensional fluid medium. You have some distance you can move. For either ships or aircraft, you have a turning radius. That is, it's very nice to say we would like to do this. However, unless you are in a flying saucer simulator, if you try to do that, the aircraft insists on having a turning radius. And you can try to make the radius tighter, but there are negative consequences, like the pilot blacks out, the wings of the airplane fall off, you lose velocity and stall and fly into the ground, or in the case of the B-52 doing deep penetration, flying a very small number of feet off the ground, the way you turn an aircraft is to bank it. In order to make this aircraft turn, the first thing you have to do is climb, because if you banked the aircraft at flight altitude, one of the wings would go through the ground. This is very bad. And so you have a turning radius limitation. You also, for aircraft, have other maneuvering limitations which are imposed by your engine thrust, air resistance, additional air resistance if you try these neat-looking maneuvers which tend to cause your airplane to slow down. For ground units, though, life gets much more complicated because ground units have to move across terrain. Of course, if you say you have a vehicle, we can drive a vehicle 30 miles an hour, and that means in one day we could cover 720 miles. you'd run out of gas. If it's a tank, the treads would fall off several times. The crew has this quaint idea that it needs to sleep. The net result is that movement in the face of the enemy is vastly slower than movement across an interstate highway system. How much slower? Well, up until the two Iraq wars, no one, despite motorization and vehicles and helicopter support, no one had ever really done a significant number of advances in one day that were more than 30 or 50 miles. And this was using vehicles that could be driven at 30 or 50 miles an hour and that were in fact being driven for much of the day. The numbers actually got larger in Iraq up to, I think, up something above 100 miles, if I recall correctly. But this is with vehicles that can be driven on flat ground as if though they were on an interstate, at least if you pull the governors, which no one would, of course, ever do. For people running on ground, well, if it's completely flat ground, you can look up running times, but you should realize that running when you are carrying 90 pounds of equipment on your back and either a rifle or some sharp spear or something are two different issues. And running, if you are trying to stay in nice, neat lines, which for a long time was extremely important, that's very different. And what you could do for maneuvering under different conditions was quite modest. What is done in board war games to simulate this is typically to say, we have a unit counter, and there's a number on it like that, and that's the movement factor. That represents its ability to move. And then if you actually attempt to move the unit, you use up points from this limit until you run out of them. And then there has to be a rule of, say, you've used 6.5 points, and to move one more space takes 1 point. Are you allowed to move or not? And there are two answers, yes and no, and they're both perfectly good. So what is typically done is to say, we have adjoining squares, and to move one space takes a movement point. Now, there are already some more sophisticated versions of this, very old. Charles Roberts said, well, we will give each army 50 movement points. That simulates control. You could move one unit 50 spaces, but the rest of your army wouldn't move at all. And you have various mixtures of options where you move smaller numbers of spaces. You then, however, notice that there's terrain that helps you move along. Helps? Oh yes, roads. And if you're actually doing road movement, a tradition is to say that instead of using 1 point of a movement to move a space, you might move a third, or use a third or a fifth or a half or some other number. And you simply move faster. An alternative choice, this is traditionally associated with railroads. And in the traditional association with railroads, it doesn't have to be railroads. You say that you could move an extra 10 spaces because you're being displaced by railroad train. It's not necessarily associated with railroads. It's just there's a bonus for moving some way as opposed to an acceleration. You also have, those are airports, and you move from point A to point B, even if A and B are very far apart, the intervening space gets ignored. Those could equally be, that's a star. That's a star. That's a warp gate, and you fly into the warp gate and you fly out the far side. And therefore you jump over a considerable distance. And I've now gone over a whole series of ways you could move faster. There are also ways you move slower. However, I see I am approaching being out of time. Last second questions on this. In that case, we are done. Class dismissed.